Hey, love. One of the things I have just really missed during this 3.5 or 4 months bullshit is reading this wonderful book with you. And so I thought, what the hell? Why don't I go ahead and I'll read a chapter? And I think I've set this video so it'll do right. And hopefully it'll be something that you'll have time to look at and maybe enjoy. Anyway, this one is chapter 5, and it's called Hands. That's where we left off. And, okay, Madeline J. was admitted to St. Benedict's Hospital near New York City in 1980. Her 60th year, a congenitally blind woman with cerebral palsy, who had been looked after by her family at home throughout her life. Given this history and her pathetic condition with spasticity and athetosis, you know what those things are, that is, involuntary movements of both hands, to which was added a failure of the eyes to develop, I expected to find her both retarded and regressed. She was neither. Quite the contrary. She spoke freely, indeed eloquently. Her speech, mercifully, was scarcely affected by spasticity, revealing herself to be a high-spirited woman of exceptional intelligence and literacy. Well, that would be you. You've read a tremendous amount, I said. You must be really at home with Braille. No, I'm not, she said. All my reading has been done for me by talking books or other people. I can't read Braille. You have to put up with those little sounds when Courtney's sending a bunch of text. Sorry about that. All of my reading has been done for me by talking books or other people. I can't read Braille, not a single word. I can't do anything with my hands. They're completely useless. She held them up derisively. Useless, godforsaken lumps of dough. They don't even feel part of me. I found this very startling. The hands are not usually affected by cerebral palsy. At least, not essentially affected. They may be somewhat spastic or weak or deformed, but are generally of considerable use, unlike the legs, which may be completely paralyzed, in that variant called Little's disease or cerebral diplegia, Diplegia. Miss J's hands were mildly spastic and athetotic, but her sensory capacity. See, this is always better when you read it. But her sensory capacities, as I now rapidly determined, were completely intact. She immediately and correctly identified light touch, pain, temperature, passive movement of the fingers. There was no impairment of elementary sensation as such, but in dramatic contrast, there was the profoundest impairment of perception. She could not recognize or identify anything whatsoever. I placed all sorts of objects in her hands, including one of my own hands. She could not identify, and she did not explore. There were no active interrogatory movements of her hands. They were indeed as inactive, as inert, as useless as lumps of dough. This is very strange, I said to myself. How can one make sense of all this? There is no gross sensory deficit. Her hands would seem to have the potential of being perfectly good hands, and yet they're not. Can it be that they are functionless, useless, because she had never used them? Had being protected, looked after, babied since birth prevented her from the normal exploratory use of hands which all infants learn in the first months of life? Sorry, we have some particularly noisy neighbors up top, not your usual crowd. Had she been carried about? Had everything done for her in a manner that had prevented her from developing a normal pair of hands? And if this was the case, it seemed far-fetched, but was the only hypothesis I could think of. Could she now, in her 60th year, acquire what she should have acquired in the first weeks and months of life? Was there any precedent? Had anything like this ever been described or tried? I did not know, but I immediately thought of a possible parallel. What was described by Leontiev and Zaporozhets in their book Rehabilitation of Hand Function, 1960 book. The condition they were describing was quite different in origin. They described a similar alienation of the hands in some 200 soldiers following massive injury and surgery. The injured hands felt foreign, lifeless, useless, stuck on, despite elementary neurological and sensory intactness. Leontiev, and that dude I can't pronounce, spoke of how the Gnostic systems that allow gnosis, Gnosis, or perceptive use of the hands to take place could be dissociated in such cases as a consequence of injury, surgery, and the weeks or months long hiatus in the use of the hands that followed. In Madeline's case, although the phenomenon was identical, uselessness, lifelessness, alienation, it was lifelong. She did not need just to recover her hands, but to discover them, to acquire them, to achieve them for the first time. Not just to regain a dissociated Gnostic system, but to construct a Gnostic system she had never had in the first place. Was this possible? The injured soldiers described by Leontiev and that person whose names I still can't pronounce had normal hands before injury. All they had to do was to remember what they had forgotten or dissociated or inactivated through severe injury. Madeline, in contrast, had no repertoire of memory, for she had never used her hands. And she felt she had no hands or arms either. She had neither fed herself, used the toilet by herself, or reached out to help herself, always leaving it for others to help her. She had behaved for 60 years as if she were a being without hands. This then was the challenge that faced us. A patient with perfect elementary sensations in the hands, but apparently no power to integrate these sensations to the level of perceptions that were related to the world and to herself. No power to say, I perceive, I recognize, I will, I act, so far as her useless hands went. But somehow or other, as Leontiev and that dude found with their patients, we had to get her to act and to use her hands actively. And we hoped, in so doing, to achieve integration. The integration is in the action, as Roy Campbell said. Madeline was agreeable to all this, indeed fascinated, but puzzled and not hopeful. How can I do anything with my hands, she asked, when they are just lumps of putty? In the beginning is the deed, Goethe writes. This may be so when we face moral or existential dilemmas, but not where movement and perception have their origin. Yet here too, there is always something sudden, a first step or a first word, as when Helen Keller said water, a first movement, a first perception, a first impulse, total, out of the blue, where there was nothing or nothing with sense before. In the beginning is the impulse, not a deed, not a reflex, but an impulse, which is both more obvious and more mysterious than either. We could not say to Madeline, do it, but we might hope for an impulse. We might solicit, we might even provoke one. I thought of the infant as it reached for the breast. Leave Madeline her food as if by accident, slightly out of reach on occasion, I suggested to her nurses. Don't starve her, don't tease her, but show less than your usual alacrity in feeding her. And one day it happened. What had never happened before. Impatient, hungry, pissed off. He doesn't say that. It happened. Instead of waiting passively and patiently, she reached out an arm, groped, found a bagel, I understand that fully, and took it to her mouth. This was the first use of her hands, her first manual act in 60 years. And it marked her birth as a motor individual, Sherrington's term for the person who emerges through acts. It also marked her first manual perception, and thus her birth as a complete perceptual individual. Her first perception, her first recognition, was of a bagel, or bagelhood, as Helen Keller's first utterance was of waterhood. After this first act, this first perception, progress was extremely rapid. As she had reached out to explore or touch a bagel, so now, in her new hunger, she reached out to explore or touch the whole world. Eating led the way. The feeling, the exploring of different foods, containers, implements, etc. Recognition had somehow to be achieved by a curiously roundabout sort of inference or guesswork, for having been both blind and handless since birth. She was lacking in the simplest internal images, whereas Helen Keller at least had tactile images. Had she not been of exceptional intelligence and literacy, with an imagination filled and sustained, so to speak, by the images of others, images conveyed by language, by the word, she might have remained almost as helpless as a baby. A bagel was recognized as round bread, with a hole in it. A fork as an elongated flat object with several sharp tines. But then this preliminary analysis gave way to an immediate intuition, and objects were instantly recognized as themselves, as immediately familiar in character and, I'm going to have to spell this, honey, Physiogonomy, were immediately recognized as unique, as old friends. And this sort of recognition, not analytic, but synthetic and immediate, went with a vivid delight and a sense that she was discovering a whole world of enchantment, mystery, and beauty. The commonest objects delighted her and stimulated a desire to reproduce them. She asked for clay and started to make models. Her first model, her first sculpture, was of a shoehorn. And even this was somehow imbued with a peculiar power and humor, with flowing, powerful, chunky curves reminiscent of an early Henry Moore. And this was within a month of her first recognitions, her attention, her appreciation moved from objects to people. There were limits, after all, to the interest and expressive possibilities of things, even when transfigured by a sort of innocent, ingenious, and often comical genius. Now she needed to explore the human face and figure at rest and in motion. To be felt by Madeline was a remarkable experience. Her hands, only such a little while ago inert, doughy, now seemed changed, with a preternatural animation and sensibility, in a way more intense and searching than any visual scrutiny, but being tasted and appreciated meditatively, imaginatively, and aesthetically by a newborn artist. They were, one felt, not just the hands of a blind woman exploring, but of a blind artist, a meditative and creative mind, just open to the full, sensuous, and spiritual reality of the world. These explorations, too, pressed for representation and reproduction as an external reality. She started to model heads and figures, and within a year was locally famous as the blind sculptress of St. Benedict's. Her sculptures tended to be half or three-quarters life-size, with simple but recognizable features, and with a remarkably expressive energy. For me, for her, for all of us, this was a deeply moving, an amazing, almost a miraculous experience. Who would have dreamed that basic powers of perception, normally acquired in the first months of life, but failing to be acquired at this time, could be acquired in one's 60th year? What wonderful possibilities of late learning and learning for the handicapped this opened up. And who could have dreamed that in this blind, palsied woman, hidden away, inactivated, overprotected all her life, there lay by germ of an astonishing artistic sensibility, unsuspected by her as by others, that would germinate and blossom into a rare and beautiful reality after remaining dormant, blighted for 60 years. Postscript. The case of Madeline J., however, as I was to find, was by no means unique. Within a year, I had encountered another patient, Simon K., who also had cerebral palsy combined with profound impairment of vision. While Mr. K had normal strength and sensation in his hands, he scarcely ever used them, and was extraordinarily inept at handling, exploring, or recognizing anything. Now, we had been alerted by Madeline J. We wondered whether he, too, might not have a similar developmental agnosia, and, as such, be treatable in the same way. And indeed, we soon found that what would have been achieved with Madeline could be achieved with Simon as well. Within a year, he had become very handy in all ways, and particularly enjoyed simple carpentry, shaping plywood and wooden blocks, and assembling them into simple wooden toys. He had no impulse to sculpt, to make reproductions. He was not a natural artist like Madeline. But still, after a half century spent virtually without hands, he enjoyed their use in all sorts of ways. So would I. This is the more remarkable, perhaps because he is mildly retarded, an amiable simpleton, in contrast to the passionate and highly gifted Madeline. It might be said that she's extraordinary, a Helen Keller, a woman in a million, but nothing like this could possibly be said of simple Simon. He must have loved phrasing that. And yet the essential achievement, the achievement of hands, proved wholly as possible for him as for her. It seems clear that intelligence, as such, plays no part in the matter, that the sole and essential thing is use. Such cases of developmental agnosia may be rare, but one commonly sees cases of acquired agnosia which illuminate the same fundamental principle of use. Thus, I frequently see patients with a severe glove and stocking neuropathy. Did I read that right? Yes, I did. So-called due to diabetes. If the neuropathy is sufficiently severe, patients go beyond feelings of numbness, the quote glove and stocking feeling, to a feeling of complete nothingness or derealization. They may feel, as one patient put it, like a basket case with hands and feet completely missing. Sometimes they feel their arms and legs end in stumps and lumps of dough, or plaster somehow stuck on. Typically, this feeling of derealization, if it occurs, is absolutely sudden. And the return of reality, if it occurs, is equally sudden. Equally sudden. There is, as it were, a critical, functional, and ontological threshold. It is crucial to get such patients to use their he emphasizes, hands and feet, even if necessary to trick them into so doing. With this, there is apt to occur a sudden re-realization, a sudden leap back into subjective quality and life, provided there is sufficient physiological potential. If the neuropathy is total, if the distal parts of the nerves are quite dead, no such re-realization is possible, he says. For patients with a severe but subtotal neuropathy, a modicum of use is literally vital and makes all the difference between being a basket case and reasonably functional. With excessive use, there may be fatigue of the limited nerve function and sudden derealization again. It should be added that these subjective feelings have precise objective correlates. One finds electrical silence locally in the muscles of the hands and the feet, and on the sensory side, a complete absence of any evoked potentials at every level up to the sensory cortex. As soon as the hands and feet are re-realized with use, there is a complete reversal of the physiological picture. A similar feeling of deadness and unrealness is described above in Chapter 3, The Disembodied Lady. This reminded me of that, which you read much better than I did. All right, I'm going to go through the mess of trying to get this file into a form that I can send it to you, and I sure as hell hope you read the next chapter to me in person. Love you. Talk to you later. Bye.